Hi, and welcome to my presentation. My name is Chris Bowman, and today we're going to be talking about number processing, and we'll be talking about a few different modeling techniques and mathematical models that are used to represent just how the brain processes numbers. So again, I'd like for this presentation to be more informal, so if you got any questions, please feel free to send them in the chat or let me know by unmuting yourself. Alrighty, so in this presentation, I'm going to be covering three main components. First, we'll be talking about how does the brain process numbers? What are some of the elemental tools that are needed in order to successfully think about numbers and solve problems? Then we're going to be talking about some abnormalities in number processing. So this could look like an inability to perform mathematical problems. This could look like an inability to understand magnitude representations. And we'll talk more on that in a bit. And then finally, we're going to end off with some response time modeling data, which is probably arguably my favorite part. So we'll save that for the end. So before we get into talking about numbers, I'd love for you to take a moment to think about what numbers mean to you and how often you see numbers in your everyday life, what sorts of contexts. Did you enjoy your mathematics classes? Do you hate numbers? Do you constantly see numbers all around you? Or are you the type of person who ignores numbers whenever they're thrown your way? And then we'll talk about some reasons for maybe why that's happening towards the end. But we'll get started today by talking about how numbers are an intrinsic feature of the human design. We are born with this ability to think and encode number magnitude, number representation, symbolic notations for numbers. And there's lots of research that shows that even babies are able to process basic magnitude representations from about 1 to 3 years old. And then moving forward, we can also talk about some of the history of animals processing numbers if you'd like. There's a really fun story called Hans the Horse. And to any of my psych majors, if you haven't heard about Hans the Horse, we're going to have a side conversation about Hans because his story is pretty cool. But anyways, around 500 AD, Arabic numbers were created, or they were said to have been created. And it wasn't about till 1200 AD that Arabic digits were received in Europe. So numbers have a long history in our society. It's just something that not everybody really knows about. Alrighty, so fast forward into 1908, we have one of the first papers that was ever published where the authors talked about how brain damage had an influence on a person's ability to process numbers. We'll talk about this one a little more later, but 1908 really is a turntable time period. In addition, we notice that over the last few hundred years, numbers have become a component of the educational system. So numbers weren't always a part of what everybody learned, but as our society evolves, so does our understanding of numbers, and which can influence things like technology and much more. So we started this presentation talking about what are some ways that we can use numbers, or when do we think of numbers. And this is really cool because all of these examples on the screen here are ones that my students have given. And notice the two biggest ones on the screen. It's time and money. And remember, to process, understand both of those values, we have to know about numbers. So if you're going to do time management, ideally you would want to understand numbers 1 through 12 and then 1 through 60 and what that magnitude represents so that you understand what time it is. Same with managing money. I don't know about y'all, but I find myself doing crude estimations in the grocery store whenever I'm adding up about how much I expect my total to be. That's another way that we use numbers. Alrighty, so whenever we're thinking about numbers, or whenever I'm thinking about numbers, I really like to think about numbers in terms of processing style. And so if you'll notice on the screen here, we have two different models. We have the Atkinson and Shiffrin model, and we have the Baddeley and Hitch model. So both of these models of working memory are really important because they are a visual representation of what we're going through when we're thinking about numbers. So for example, we'll start here in the sensory memory. Your sensory memory is the senses picking up information in your environment, and that information is sent to your short-term memory where it is processed. And if the information is needed for later use, you'll store it in your long-term memory. So in terms of processing numbers, I'd like for us to think of our sensory memory as our encoding phase. This is where we're reading the number representations. Then in our short-term memory, this is where we're actually thinking about the numbers. We're actually solving the problem of 2 plus 2 or 5 plus 2. And then if we need to remember that, obviously we'll sort of the long-term, or in the moment, we'll have an output representation. So this is moving on to the next model here. We have Baddeley and Hitch's model, and we'll talk about this one more on the next slide. But what I want us to note here is that our central executive is in control of our attentional base for what we're paying attention to. So your central executive is responsible for not only recognizing what episode or what events are going on, and also being able to process spatially. It's also responsible for the phonological loop, which, by the way, as we're talking right now, we're activating all three of these processes. So the episodic buffer would remember this as the episode of this presentation is occurring. These are the dynamics and the specifics. Your visuospatial sketchpad is responsible for what is on what you're seeing and spatially how it's represented. But your phonological loop, this is the one that is responsible for you hearing the information, right? So you're hearing me speak, your phonological loop is recognizing that information and perhaps encoding it in the short term to move it to the long term. So more on this idea of encoding. Encoding, I like to tell my students, is a fancy word for reading. Does it literally mean reading? Not really, but it means that we're taking that outside input and making it internal. So encoding can be impacted by how numbers are presented. So for example, there's a lot of research that shows that reading number digits, so reading the number 4 but spelled out F-O-U-R, would take more time to process than reading the symbolic digit or the symbolic Arabic digit, excuse me. So a moment ago, we were talking about the phonological loop. I want to point out that some researchers, specifically Joanne Lefebvre, noted that when people have a higher capacity in their phonological loop, they also report to have higher arithmetic performance. So the more information that you can keep and process in your phonological loop seems to also connect with a high mathematical performance. Now, on the opposite end of high mathematical performance, we have some limitations. So, for example, one things that would make it challenging to perform mathematical concepts would be things like the ability to read, so people with dyslexia, and an ability to process numbers, which is called dyscalculia, which we'll talk about more in a bit. And then also things like anxiety and individual situations, so rest and motivation. So really where we're talking about rest and motivation, we'll see a little bit more when we talk about numbers in the school system and trying to collect data and performance abilities with children. And I would also like us to take a moment to consider the quality of a mental code. So for example, we have things that could either be a crude estimation, maybe you're not fully listening to the problem, maybe you're not fully encoding it, compared to precise accuracy. Oh, you're fully paying attention, you're fully aware of what's going on. You know that 4 means this many, rather than maybe a crude estimation of 4 rounding up to be around the neighborhood of 5. So the next stage that we have in the line of processing numbers is called the search and compute stage. So this is the decision stage, right? This is where our brain is pulling together all of the pieces. We're pulling from our long-term memory, we're pulling in our short-term memory to try to solve a problem. What's an example of a problem, Ms. Bowman? Well, we'll keep it simple, 2 plus 2. Now, for the most part, we as a group would be able to process 2 plus 2 is 4 relatively quickly, right? But in children, that might take a little bit. We might see some finger counting. We might see some extra processing time for this stage. But if I were to ask y'all, what's 23 plus 27? That's normally the one that gets my students of like, oh my God, I don't know how much it is. Well, it's 50, just, so we're all on the same page. But we would have to take the time to process that in our brains to come up with an answer. Now, this is where information can concurrently be processed and stored. Again, this is a kind of combining the long-term memory and the short-term memory, or the working memory, if you will. So during this time, we expect our people to be using the approximate and the exact number systems, so estimating and counting. We expect quantification or subitizing. And then finally, we expect some arithmetic, so fact retrieval and computation during this time period. So we're going to give an example of why numbers can be challenging to process. And numbers are so fascinating to me because we have different labels and different types of meaning that we assign to numbers used in different ways. So let me give you this example. So it says, despite a 78-yard run by the number 34, the Bears lost by 2 touchdowns and dropped into 6th place. Now, I'm not a football fan. I really don't know what all this means. But what I will say is there are 3 different examples of numbers on here. So we have our first example would be the 78-yard run. That 78 is a magnitude number that represents the quantity and amount, which can also be called cardinality. The next number we have is the number 34. Well, that 34 represents a label for this identifying person. So this 34 isn't a measure of order or a quantity value. It is a label representation. The number of 34 is how we note this one specific player. And then finally, we have 2 touchdowns, which is again is another quantity or amount, and then dropped into 6th place. Well, 6th place now is different because 6th place is a ranking order. We went from 1st, now we're to 6th. And that inherently means that since we dropped into 6th place, our team is not doing as well as they were doing before in a ranking system. So all of these examples show us quantity, rank, and label, which are different ways that we can utilize numbers in everyday language and communication styles. So not only does it take awareness of the different meanings that numbers have and the magnitudes of numbers, what that indicates, but we can also pay attention to what do we need to successfully process numbers? What would we teach children so that they could successfully process numbers? Well, first, we need to have a knowledge of the basic mechanisms of mathematical concepts. So counting, we would want everyone to be able to understand the basics of counting 0 through on and on and on, right? The second thing is we would want to have an understanding of mathematical concepts like probability, algebra, arithmetic. We would need to know how those systems operate. And then number 3 is the ability to solve the problems. Now, if we have individuals that can mark all 3 of these and move on in their life, we can assume that they are efficiently processing numbers. But again, I'm really interested in those who aren't using these 3 efficiently and effectively. Now, in a very cognitive, psychological way, researchers have taken the concept of processing numbers and turned it into 2 different types of concepts that need to be used. So one of them is conceptual and one of them is procedural, which we'll talk about more now. So procedural knowledge refers to the how-to we're going to accomplish a goal. This often occurs whenever we can see an individual confidently and correctly know which steps to follow to solve a given problem. One example is the function of borrowing, such as in subtraction. We can see on the right-hand side here, we have a subtraction going on and we have some borrowing there so that the individual can solve the problem. Now, what's really nice about procedural knowledge is it's really relatively easy to observe. Procedural knowledge is asking, can you do it efficiently and correctly? But on the other hand, we have conceptual knowledge. Conceptual knowledge is asking why. So if you were to ask a child why we used the borrowing principle and they were able to efficiently and accurately tell you why, then we would assume that they have procedural knowledge and conceptual knowledge. Another example is the base 10 system. This is also known as the decimal system. This is a big one for people to get. You know, I am very interested in this topic, mostly because of my stats students I've had over the years. And one thing I noticed is that I would have students with excellent GPAs, excellent performance records, excellent attendance, but statistics scared them to pieces. And one of the reasons why is number 1, a fear of math, but number 2, there are some expected systems that you should know when you're in college, or at least by the time that you reach your college level statistics course, that people were not confident in. And one of them actually is the base 10 system. Alrighty, so moving forward, though, we can go down that tangent later. So conceptual knowledge is tricky to investigate because it questions the internal cognitive functioning rather than the external performance like procedural knowledge does. So on the note of conceptual knowledge, when an individual has a high conceptual knowledge, we can note that it's linked with several abilities, such as an understanding of magnitude, number sense, mathematical fluency, and number line navigation. Yet when an individual has poor conceptual knowledge, we can see it that they don't really understand non-symbolic representations of magnitude. They have a low number sense, they can have low mathematical fluency. And one of the ways that we can notice or observe this is we can see that individuals have a difficult time navigating the number line. What does that mean, Miss Bowman? Well, on the bottom here, we have 0 to 8. And if I were to ask you to from 0 to 8 label where the number 4 is, most of you in this room would be able to accurately and efficiently say, oh yeah, 4 is right down the middle because 4 is halfway between 0 and 8. I understand the proportion of what half means. Whereas somebody with a low mathematical fluency or low mathematical ability might not be able to understand the proportion of half and be able to label efficiently and correctly. Alrighty, so one thing I really want to specify is the difference between non-symbolic and symbolic representations. So Non-symbolic representations are like this example in the corner over here to the right. Do we all see the 4 dots that are there? That is a non-symbolic representation, meaning there is not a symbolic number presented. We only have the raw 4 data points. Whereas symbolic representations means that we've turned it into a symbol. So for example, see the number 4 down there. That means that we've taken it from non-symbolic, here are some dots, an array of dots, to symbolic, here's the number 4. This could also look like spelling out F-O-U-R, which I made a note to myself to change that to F-O-U-R instead of the number 4. But one of the really cool things about numbers that I found when I was doing this research is that numbers are distinct, accurate, and culturally dependent. And I think this is why I like numbers so much, is because they're distinct, accurate. You're not going to argue with me that that's the number 4 or that those are 4 dots, right? It's distinct. This is what it is. But that culturally dependent part is very interesting because, as you know, different numbers are represented in different words across different languages. So for example, F-O-U-R is the English spelling of the number 4, right? But what about in Spanish or French? We're going to have different spellings, but it's still going to represent the same numerical magnitude or representation, and that can vary based on your culture. Alrighty, so now that we have a little bit of an understanding of what basic components are needed to process numbers, now we're going to switch gears and talk a little bit more about abnormalities. So what about those who struggle with math or those who can't do math? So for example, I have a couple difficulties up here. So sometimes we see people, and we're not just talking about children here, we're talking about people, that when they see numbers, they can forget the names of those numbers. Right? So seeing the number 4 and recognizing that that's F-O-U-R 4 is a huge deal because that means that you can successfully correspond the symbol and the word and the non-symbolic representation, which is not something that everybody can do. A lot of times we see people mixing up symbols or writing numbers backwards, which sounds a lot like dyslexia, right? And then also we can see that some people struggle to understand how 5 plus 1 equals 6, or how 3 plus 3 also equals 6. So when we're talking about the abnormalities and how they became prevalent in our society, going back to that 1908 paper with Lewandowski and Stadelman, they had a 27-year-old man who had brain damage. Now, his cognitive functioning was fine. They noticed that his intelligence level was normal, but when they tested him on numbers, he was unable to recognize the symbols and to recall the names of those number symbols. So here we have an example of where brain damage can cause some difficulties. Moving forward about 10 years, we have Solomon Hinshin, who noted that it is possible to be intelligent, but have limited mathematical abilities. And I want y'all to think about how one of the measures for intelligence is mathematical testing, right? People who can use math well tend to have a higher intelligence score. So what about those who have a normal cognitive functioning, but can't process numbers or don't have a mathematical brain, as Butterworth called it? Now, in 1949, Dr. Joseph Gersman coined the term counting badly. So at first, it was noted that some people just count bad. Then moving on to the 1970s, we have Dr. Laszlo Koisk, who noted that there must be a structural disorder between those who have a normal mathematical ability and those who do not. And then moving forward into 1997, we have Dr. Stanlis DeHaan, who is one of the foundational researchers in the field of numerical cognition. He wrote a book called The Number Sense, and he noted that for some people, there was a fundamental inability to conceptualize numbers as abstract concepts and then to compare those quantities. And it wasn't until 2013 that in the DSM-5, right, which is our Bible of how we diagnose things in the field of psychological sciences, that there are some people who have struggles processing math, and it can be labeled in the umbrella term of a specific learning disorder. So learning disabilities, whenever we're talking about somebody having an inability to process information, the challenges are normally in reading, writing, spelling, and math. They can also occur in our auditory, visual, sensor, and social processing. Learning disabilities are distinct from disadvantages based on cultural, economic, or environmental factors. So what does that mean? Learning disabilities should not be labeled as individuals who are lazy or don't want to do the work or can't even, right? It means that whenever they're trying to process information, there's an extra series of hurdles that they're experiencing internally to be able to pull out the correct information. Those hurdles can look different for different people, hence why it's so hard to study. Now, on the bottom here, I have this arrow that's representative of spectrum. And we can see on the far left-hand side, we have what's called savantism. Savantism is whenever a person is a genius in a given area. So we have mathematical savants, people who are excellent with numbers. They can process numbers like no other. There are people who you can tell them a date and they can tell you exactly where it goes on the calendar because their internal, maybe visuospatial sketchpad is very enhanced and can physically process or can mentally process where everything would be. Lower down the food chain, we have mathematical learning disability, which we talked about a little bit. This is an umbrella term, right? This is, oh, this child struggles with math. They should probably have a 504 or an intervention plan or be in special education. But then on the far end of the spectrum, we have what's called dyscalculia, which is the most severe example of a learning disability in mathematics, which we'll talk more about now. Alrighty, so remember, dyscalculia was originally called counting badly. So this is for individuals who can have normal intelligence and motivation, but struggle to process numbers despite continuous effort. So classes, teachers working with them, interventions, tutors, right? There just continues to be this struggle with numbers. Now, remember, it was originally put into the DSM-5 in 2013. This number blindness can obstruct processing stages for mastering number facts, calculation, and number sense. So this is a hurdle that stands in the way of being able to cultivate a deep understanding of numbers. And based on the research we have right now, it impacts about 3 to 7% of the population. Note that we'll talk about why that might or might not be correct, but as of now, it is 3 to 7% of the population. And I want us to take a minute to look at the visual on the right-hand side and just notice how the person in blue is able to clearly think about 1 + 5 = 6. How funny that that example's in there again. But then this person on the right in red, we can see that this looks like a mind jumbling. And this is a representation of what it can look like in the brain of somebody who has dyscalculia. Very interesting, right? Alrighty, so the cause of dyscalculia. Well, guess what, everybody? We don't know. We actually have no clue what causes dyscalculia. There are different research projects that are going out to define where the locus of the processing abnormality is, and I have my own hypothesis of where I believe that to be. But two ideas are that dyscalculia occurs in what's called domain-specific processing, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But domain-specific processing is whenever you have, it's within your working memory. It's all of the things that you need to learn any given topic, to process any given information. I'm sorry, that's domain general. I described the wrong one to you. Let me start over. Okay. Domain general is the one that you need for any style of processing, any piece of information, anything new you're going to learn, right? Whereas domain-specific processing is specific to that skill that you're trying to learn. So domain-specific processing would involve mathematics specifically. So two hypotheses of where this abnormality occurs is one of them is in the number module deficit hypothesis. So this is the magnitude representation, the inability to process a magnitude and approximate where it goes in the number system. The next one is the access deficit hypothesis, which says that people have an inability to build the connection between non-symbolic and symbolic representations. So again, we're going to look a little bit more at domain general and domain specifically. And actually, I'm going to make a note to myself to switch these two because that would make my presentation flow better. So thank you all for being here. Alrighty, so again, domain general is any information that's necessary to process new information, whereas domain specific is what you need to process math. So this numerosity tool. So researchers are asking, they're saying, well, is this a working memory problem? Is this an executive functioning problem? Or is this a deeper inability with specifically numbers? So for example, ADHD is a great item to look at here because ADHD can have an impact on attention and the ability to pay attention to the given stimulus at hand. That would be more in your working memory. We would expect that to be more domain general because it influences every type of processing that an individual would do. Whereas with dyscalculia, it would directly impact the numerosity tool. Now, that's not to say somebody can't have both ADHD and dyscalculia. And there is some research that shows that about 50% of people have a dual diagnosis of both of these together, hand in hand. It was actually 49% estimated, but I rounded. Alrighty, so how do we diagnose dyscalculia? Ms. Bowman, I've never even heard of anybody having this. I've heard of people having dyslexia, but what about dyscalculia? Well, dyscalculia is incredibly hard to diagnose. And in fact, I didn't realize how hard it was to diagnose until doing this research. So there isn't one appropriate diagnostic criteria for dyscalculia. In fact, it's really based on the researchers and the distribution of scores, which we'll talk about more in a moment. But we do have a variety of different testing in schools and laboratory testing that we can use. So here on this visual, we have a mathematical domain, the base 10 system. Remember, we talked about how that is the decimal system, and we have our two types of knowledge, conceptual and procedural. So is the problem here, or is it an underlying cognitive system, or is it the problem in the central executive? So this visual gives a great job of identifying where some of the different problems could be. Now, one thing I want us to talk about is that when people or when students noticeably have a math learning disability, they're put into perhaps an intervention program, perhaps a 504, but most parents don't seek out further testing of their child's mathematical ability. The child gets put in the umbrella term of a or a specific learning disability, and parents don't necessarily move forward in testing, which might be a good idea. But when a diagnosis is received, it's not necessarily just that one participant who's receiving the diagnosis. Instead, their scores are compared to a certain percentile of their given demographic, which we'll talk about more. Alrighty, so I'm not going to go through all of these, but here is a list of the different curriculum tests that one could do. Actually, I asked a diagnostician if I could see an example of these, and the diagnostician was not allowed to give them to some of them to me because they are under lock and key. For example, we wouldn't want to have access to these tests and then give them to our children, and then our children, be tested at school but perform better because they've had practice. So I thought that was interesting. But now we're going to get into the part that I'm really interested in, which is called neuropsychological tests, or these lab tests. So on the screen here, I have a couple of examples of different types of tests that we could give to any individual and then be able to perform well. But it would be very interesting to give these cognitive tasks to individuals with maybe a math learning disability or dyscalculia to see their performance. And a lot of researchers have done this. In fact, two research groups, Gilmore, Clayton, and Craig in 2018, they used a number line estimation task where they noticed that people with dyscalculia struggle to create a mental number line, right, due to impairments with spatial awareness. So this is really cool because we've already looked at a number line, and we've already discussed how if you have a high conceptual knowledge, you're more likely to be able to process numbers efficiently and effectively on a number line. In addition, we have Furman and Rubinstein, who studied the enumeration task, which we don't have time to get into today, but they noticed that they were able to see the locus of dyscalculia, which I realize now I'm going to edit that slide a little more too to say something more beneficial than that. But moving forward, this diagram, we won't spend too much time here, but this is DeHaan in his 1992 diagram of the triple code model. So what DeHaan is getting at here is there's three main components for where we're processing numbers. We have our visual Arabic code that we're visually inputting, that we're seeing. We have our auditory verbal code that we're hearing. And we have this analog magnitude representation of our brain being able to pull forward what is the magnitude representation of these numbers. And so the idea here is that perhaps teasing apart response time modeling or perhaps teasing apart performance scores to see where the struggle is could help us influence and know more about dyscalculia. Now, it would be beyond me to not mention that there are many environmental considerations here. This is why I asked you to think about math at the beginning, right? Some things to consider are your classroom environment, your peers, perhaps individual fear and anxiety. One of the very common things we see in mathematics is called thought paralysis, where when you ask people a mathematics question, they freeze. And I've seen this frequently in the stats courses that I've taught. My favorite example is to tell people what's 25 plus 25. And they say, oh, it's 50. I'm like, great, we know that. What's 23 plus 27? And noticing the fear that happens in people's eyes is like, oh my goodness, 25 plus 25. Well, we've practiced this with quarters and percents and all of the like, but 27 plus 23, oh, well, it's also 50. So that thought paralysis can definitely play a major role on response time modeling for sure. So what are some of the solutions to dyscalculia? Well, one of them is creating this deeper and more elaborative student learning profiles. This is a major argument by Daniel Ansari. He's over in the University of London, Ontario. And his argument is we need multiple testing points for students rather than one a year where we put them into different categories. Perhaps we could have several at different rates. One of the biggest arguments that he makes is what, specifically with students, perhaps that day they're tired, or perhaps that day they're not motivated, or perhaps they have a bad teacher that year. And so the next year we might see that they perform just fine on their mathematical abilities, whereas the year before maybe they didn't. So again, those are environmental considerations I just mentioned to you, but these student learning profiles could really shed some light onto students' performance. Another common solution I found in the research is manipulatives. So these are little representations. And actually, I'm going to make a note to myself. I'll add a picture of manipulatives. So Unifix cubes, do y'all remember, the little bitty cubes that you can put all together in the classroom, right? So those are common tools for learning. Now, there are some arguments against Unifix cubes due to their effectiveness, but that's a whole other research study that we can talk about later. Alrighty, so then we have things like small groups, one-to-one interventions, number games that could also help in the ability to enhance numerical and mathematical abilities. But the solution that I personally feel we should pay attention to is, what about thinking about the data differently? Alrighty, so my stats students, hopefully you've seen this before, right? So this is a normal distribution. And what we would expect on a normal distribution is that the majority of the population is here in the middle, right? And then we would expect our savants, our people who are really good with their mathematical abilities, to be over here in 2 standard deviations above the mean. But what we commonly see with people diagnosed with dyscalculia is their scores are based on a normal distribution compared to other people in their demographic. And if they are 2 standard deviations below the mean, that is how we're diagnosing most of dyscalculia. So no wonder it's only 3 to 7%, because we wouldn't expect there to be a lot of people at that very bottom 2 standard deviations away from the mean. Remember, by the way, that would be statistically significant. But is that really getting to the heart of diagnosing dyscalculia, or is that just comparing the differences between the population and the individual? So my personal hypothesis, I think it would be very cool to do some response time modeling with individuals who have dyscalculia or mathematics learning disabilities. So response time data, one of the most well-known researchers for this type of work is Luce, 1986, and he talks about how response time data is the crux to understanding underlying cognitive processes. So why wouldn't we use response time data to make inferences about what's happening internally? Now, I have this linear regression example. This is a common example for how people use response time data. We're not going to go over that because I think we're running out of time. But we're going to move straight forward into what's called an accumulator model. Alrighty, so this specific model that we're looking at is called the shifted wall model. And what this model does is it accumulates information to build a set of parameter estimates. Okay, Ms. Bowman, what did you just say? Alrighty, so does everybody see this equation right here, this lovely piece of mumbo jumbo down there? Alrighty, so what happens with a model like this is we put in the response time data. So from the moment that a specific stimulus is received on the screen to when an individual gives a response, maybe via button press, we're measuring that amount of time. Keep in mind, we're talking about milliseconds here. We're not talking about a lot of time. Most people can solve 2 + 2 is 4 very quickly and accurately and effectively. But could we take that data and plug it through this series of equations and get 3 parameter estimates that have been used to index different cognitive processes? So let's talk about that. Alrighty, so these 3 right here, these are our parameter estimates. So this first one here, this is response threshold. This is the amount of information that the participant needs to accumulate in their brain in order to solve the problem or give an answer. The next parameter estimate is called drift rate. This is the process of gathering data and having more information for here, but then wait a minute, let me think about that again. And it's called a random walk, but this decision process is moving us slowly until finally we reach the amount of information that was needed to be accumulated. And then finally, the third parameter estimate is non-decision time, which this is reflective of the time it took to maybe read the problem, or it took to put an output such as a button press or give your decision response. So what can we do with these parameter estimates? Well, these parameter estimates are said to directly reflect certain cognitive processing. So for example, the non-decision time would reflect our encoding and output. The response threshold and the drift rate would reflect the information that's happening in our short-term memory and our long-term memory, which are the cognitive processes that are underlying occurring. Yes, you're reading, but that's not really what we're gauging here. I'm not wanting to know how fast you read. I'm wanting to know how much time it takes you to solve a given problem mathematically. So some future directions. Obviously, I would love to take response time modeling and see if there's a difference in scores between our participants. My hypothesis would be that our individuals with dyscalculia would have a more extended drift rate and a heightened response threshold. They would need to accumulate more information. They would need to take more time. They would have more cognitive hurdles to jump over, right? Because they have a cognitive abnormality. I think it would be really cool to look at some task switching items. There's a lot of research, and for my students as well, that shows that whenever you're focused on a task, you're putting so much cognitive effort into that given task, but then all of a sudden, let's say your phone rings or you decide you need to check your Facebook and you switch your attention drastically. We see what's called switching costs, which is where your brain is still thinking about that task A, but you've now moved on to task B. So your brain is not prepared to be fully activated in task B. So this is where researchers recommend taking distinctive breaks between cognitive activities so that you can fully be focused and present for them. Not president. Alrighty. And then potential technological advancements. It would be really cool to do some studies with maybe some VR headsets and see how people are responding to numbers in that frame. It would be interesting to use different types of mathematical models since we have more sophisticated abilities to measure response time data. And with that being said, thank you so much for attending, and I am grateful that you listened. I want to give a big shout out to all of my students. Thank you all for showing up and giving me this floor space to practice this. I'm far less nervous now, which is great. And do we have any questions? I'm going to stop the recording, by the way, but thanks again.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All righty.
I don't really have any questions.